The letter arrived at dawn, and by noon, Duke Alexander Whitmore had already refused to attend his own father's funeral. Mr. Collins, the butler, stood frozen near the study door, the black-edged card still trembling slightly in his hand. He had delivered thousands of messages to his master over the years, but never one that made the Duke's face turn to stone so quickly. "You are certain, Your Grace? The service is tomorrow. Your absence will be noticed by everyone in London." "Let them notice." Alexander did not look up from the papers on his desk. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment for years without knowing it would ever truly come. "My father made his choices. I will make mine." Collins bowed and left the room, though his footsteps lingered outside the door a moment longer than necessary, as if he hoped the Duke might call him back and say he had changed his mind. He did not. Alone now, Alexander allowed himself one breath of something close to grief, though he would never have called it that. He rose from his chair and walked to the tall window overlooking the garden his mother had once tended with her own hands, before illness took her when he was only 12 years old. After her death, his father, Duke Edmund Whitmore, had changed. The warmth that once filled their home in Hampshire disappeared, replaced by long silences at the dinner table and closed doors that were never explained. Alexander remembered the exact day the distance became permanent. He was 17, home from school for the summer, eager to share news of his studies. He had found his father in the library, staring at a portrait of his late wife, and when Alexander spoke, Edmund had turned to him with an expression Alexander had never forgotten. Not sadness, not anger. Something colder. Disappointment, perhaps, though for what reason Alexander could never determine. From that day forward, Edmund Whitmore treated his only son as a stranger who happened to share his house. Letters between them, once frequent, became rare and formal. Visits grew shorter. By the time Alexander reached his 20s and took up residence in London to manage the family's shipping interests, the two men spoke perhaps twice a year, and always about business, never about anything that mattered. Now Edmund was dead, and Alexander felt nothing he could name. Not sorrow, not relief, only a strange, hollow quiet, as though a door he had long ago stopped knocking on had finally been sealed shut for good. He returned to his desk and tried to focus on a shipping contract that required his signature, but the words blurred together. His mind kept drifting back to childhood memories he had buried for years, his father teaching him to ride a horse in the meadow behind their estate, laughing in a way Alexander had almost forgotten he was capable of. Before everything changed, he pushed the memories away. They belonged to a man who no longer existed, replaced by someone cold and unreachable. A knock came at the door, Collins again, though his expression had shifted from concern to something more urgent. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. There is a young woman here to see you. She says it concerns your father, and that the matter cannot wait." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Tell her I am not receiving visitors today." "I did tell her that, Your Grace. She would not leave. She says she has traveled from Hampshire, and will not go until she has spoken with you directly." Something in Collins's tone made Alexander look up. The butler was not a man given to exaggeration, yet there was an unusual note of insistence in his voice, as though even he sensed this visitor was not one to be turned away easily. "Her name?" "Miss Charlotte Ashworth, Your Grace." The name meant nothing to Alexander. He searched his memory for any connection to his father's business associates, distant relatives or acquaintances, and found none. Curiosity, faint but present, cut through his irritation. "5 minutes," he said finally. "No more." Collins nodded and withdrew. Moments later, the study door opened again, and a young woman stepped inside. She could not have been older than 23, dressed simply but neatly in a traveling coat that showed signs of a long and hurried journey. Her dark hair was pulled back from a face that held none of the nervous timidity Alexander expected from an unexpected visitor. Instead, her eyes, a clear and steady gray, met his directly, without hesitation or apology. "Your Grace." She dropped a small, correct curtsy, though her gaze never left his face. "Thank you for seeing me. You have 5 minutes, Miss Ashworth, and I confess I cannot imagine what business you might have with me on the day before my father's funeral, which I do not intend to attend." If the statement shocked her, she did not show it. "I am aware of your intentions, Your Grace. That is precisely why I came today, rather than waiting until tomorrow." Alexander gestured for her to continue, though impatience colored his tone. "Then speak." Charlotte reached into the small bag she carried and withdrew a sealed letter, the wax stamp bearing an insignia Alexander recognized immediately as his father's own signet. His chest tightened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Your father gave me this letter 3 weeks before he died," Charlotte said. He made me promise that I would deliver it to you myself, in person, and that I would do so only on the day of his funeral, whether or not you chose to attend it. And why would my father entrust something so important to a stranger, rather than his solicitor, or his household? Charlotte's expression flickered, something guarded passing behind her steady eyes. Because I am not entirely a stranger to him, Your Grace, though I understand that name means nothing to you. Alexander studied her more closely now, searching for some resemblance, some clue to explain her presence in his life at this precise, unwelcome moment. He found nothing familiar in her features, and yet something about her certainty, her refusal to be dismissed, unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Give me the letter then, and you may go. I cannot. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the sealed envelope. Your father was very specific. I am to remain until you have read it, and I am to answer any questions you have, if you wish to ask them. He believed you would have many. You presume to know what I will think or feel, Miss Ashworth, based on instructions from a man I barely knew in the final years of his life. I presume nothing, Your Grace. I only carry out what I promised a dying man I would do. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it, a quiet strength that reminded Alexander, uncomfortably, of his mother. He extended his hand. Charlotte placed the letter into it, and for a brief moment, their fingers nearly touched before she withdrew hers quickly, folding her hands in front of her, as though bracing herself for whatever came next. Alexander stared down at the seal, his father's familiar crest pressed into dark red wax. He had received hundreds of letters from Edmund Whitmore over the years, all of them formal, distant, businesslike. This one felt different in his hands, heavier somehow, though it weighed no more than any other piece of paper. Why does this matter so much to you? He asked, surprising himself with the question. You could have left this with my solicitor and been done with your obligation. Why insist on delivering it yourself, and remaining after? For the first time since entering the room, Charlotte's composure wavered, just slightly, a shadow crossing her face before she mastered it again. Because your father asked me to make certain you understood something before you dismissed his memory entirely. He was afraid, Your Grace, that you would bury him without ever knowing the truth. The truth about what? Charlotte's gray eyes held his, and when she spoke, her voice dropped lower, quieter, as though the words themselves carried weight she did not wish to release too quickly. About why he became the man you grew to resent. About what happened after your mother died, and what he did to protect you from something far worse than his silence. Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, a crack forming in the careful wall he had built around every memory of his father. He looked down at the letter in his hands, then back at the woman standing before him, unwilling to leave until her purpose was fulfilled. Sit down, Miss Ashworth, he said finally, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. It seems you and I have a great deal to discuss. She did not smile, but something in her posture eased slightly as she took the offered seat. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, and somewhere across the city, preparations continued for a funeral that Alexander had sworn he would not attend. He was no longer certain that promise would hold. Before opening it, Alexander set the letter down for a moment and studied Charlotte again, as though searching her face for answers she had not yet given. You said you are not entirely a stranger to my father. I would like to understand what that means before I read whatever is inside this envelope. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap, choosing her words with visible care. 3 years ago, my own father passed away, leaving my mother and myself with very little. We had no relations to turn to, and few prospects. Your father, through circumstances I did not fully understand at the time, became aware of our situation and offered assistance. He arranged for a small cottage near the edge of the Whitmore estate and saw that my mother wanted for nothing in her final illness. My father was not known for such generosity, Alexander said, unable to keep a trace of bitterness from his voice. Perhaps not to you, Charlotte replied gently, but I saw a different man than the one you describe. A man who visited quietly, who never wished for thanks, who seemed to carry a weight he would not name. I did not understand it then. I believe I am beginning to understand it now, though the full truth belongs to him, and to that letter. Alexander absorbed this in silence. It did not match the portrait he had carried of his father for over a decade, the distant figure who could not be bothered to write more than a few cold lines twice a year. And yet something in Charlotte's voice, the certainty of someone who had witnessed it firsthand, made it difficult to dismiss entirely. You still have not told me why he chose you, of all people, to carry this letter. I asked him the same question, Your Grace, when he first pressed it into my hands. He said that anyone connected to his household or his solicitors might be tempted to open it early, or to deliver it under gentler circumstances than he intended. He wanted it to reach you exactly as written, at the exact moment he chose, and he believed I was the one person with no reason to soften his words on his behalf. And are you certain you have no reason to soften them? Something flickered behind her steady gray eyes, quick and difficult to name. I have read every letter he ever gave me to deliver on his behalf, Your Grace, though never opened one meant for someone else. This is the first time I have carried something I do not fully understand myself. I promise you, I have no wish to shape your reaction to it, only to see his final wish honored. Alexander nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered at the edges of his mind. He glanced once more toward the window, where the light had shifted further toward evening, and thought of the empty chair that would sit at the front of tomorrow's service, the seat reserved for a son who had refused to come. Very well, he said quietly. Let us see what truth my father found too difficult to speak aloud while he still had breath to say it. He broke the seal. The paper crackled beneath his fingers, and inside, in his father's familiar sloping handwriting, the first line read only this: My son, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time to tell you myself, and I am trusting a stranger with the truth I could never find the courage to speak aloud. Alexander's hands went still. Across from him, Charlotte watched in silence, her expression unreadable, waiting for whatever came next with the patience of someone who had carried this burden a very long way to see it through. The words on the page blurred for a moment before Alexander forced his eyes to focus again. His father's handwriting, once so precise in every business letter Alexander had ever received, wavered here, uneven in places, as though the hand that wrote it had trembled with the effort. My son, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time to tell you myself, and I am trusting a stranger with the truth I could never find the courage to speak aloud. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I ask only that you finish reading before you decide I do not deserve it. Alexander read the next lines in silence, his jaw tightening with every sentence. Charlotte sat across from him, still and watchful, her hands folded in her lap, giving him the privacy of his own reaction without looking away entirely. The letter continued for 2 full pages, and by the time Alexander reached the final line, his hands had gone cold. He set the paper down slowly on the desk, as though it might shatter, and stared at it without speaking for a long moment. He says, Alexander finally said, his voice rougher than he intended, that my mother's death was not what I believed it to be. Charlotte's expression remained carefully composed, though something in her eyes told him this was not news to her. What did you believe, Your Grace, if I may ask? That she fell ill, and the illness took her, as illness sometimes does, without reason or fairness. Alexander's fingers tightened against the edge of the desk. That is what I was told as a boy of 12, and what I have believed every day since. And what does the letter say instead? Alexander picked the paper back up, though he did not need to read it again to recall the words that had already carved themselves into his memory. He says there were complications no physician could explain, and that in her final weeks, she asked him to keep something from me, something she believed would hurt me more than her death itself ever could. He looked up at Charlotte, searching her face for some sign she already knew what came next, and found only quiet patience waiting for him to continue at his own pace. She was afraid, Alexander read aloud now, his voice low, that if you knew the truth of her illness, you would blame yourself for something that was never your fault. And so I made a promise to her, that I have kept for 11 years, though it cost me the closeness we once shared. I let you believe I had grown cold toward you, when in truth, I could not look at you without seeing the price I paid for her peace of mind. Alexander stopped reading and set the letter down again, his breathing unsteady. What price? What is he speaking of? Charlotte hesitated, and for the first time since entering the study, uncertainty crossed her features. Your Grace, I believe the rest of that answer lies further in the letter, not with me. I was asked only to deliver it and to answer questions once you had read it fully. I do not know every detail of what happened between your parents. I know only what your father chose to share with me in the months before his death, and even that was incomplete. Alexander picked the letter back up, forcing himself to continue. The next section described, in careful and painful detail, how Alexander's mother had suffered from an illness of the mind in her final year, not merely of the body, a condition the physicians of the time had little understanding of, and even less compassion for. She had grown convinced, in her worst moments, that she was failing her son, that her illness was somehow his burden to carry, and she had begged Edmund never to let Alexander know how deeply her mind had suffered alongside her body. He says she believed I would spend my life trying to fix something that could never be fixed, Alexander said quietly, that I would blame myself for not being able to save her, the way children sometimes do, and that the kindest thing he could do was let me grieve a simple loss rather than a complicated one. And instead, Charlotte said softly, he became distant, so that you would not ask questions he had promised never to answer. Alexander nodded slowly, the pieces of 11 years finally beginning to arrange themselves into a shape he could recognize, even if he did not yet know what to do with it. He says here that every time he looked at me, he saw her fear reflected back, and he did not know how to be close to me, without breaking the promise he made to a dying woman he loved more than his own comfort. The room fell quiet. Outside, the sound of carriages passing on the street below drifted faintly through the window, a reminder that the world continued moving even as Alexander's understanding of his entire childhood rearranged itself before him. There is more, Alexander said finally, turning to the second page. His voice had grown quieter now, less certain. He mentions you directly, Miss Ashworth. Charlotte's composure faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something uncertain passing behind her eyes before she recovered it. What does he say? Alexander read aloud once more. Charlotte's mother, Margaret, was your mother's closest friend and companion in her final years, the one person she trusted enough to speak honestly with about her fears. When Margaret herself fell into hardship after her husband's death, I felt it was owed to your mother's memory that I ensure her daughter never suffered the way your mother once feared you would suffer. Charlotte does not know the full extent of this debt. I ask that you tell her, if you feel she deserves to know. Alexander looked up at Charlotte, watching her absorb this new piece of information with visible surprise. You did not know this? I knew my mother and yours had been close, Charlotte admitted, her voice quieter now than before. I did not know the connection ran so deep, or that your father's kindness toward us was tied so directly to a promise made to your mother. I believed it was simple generosity, the kind wealthy men sometimes extend to those in need, nothing more. It seems my father was a man of more promises than either of us understood, Alexander said, and for the first time since Charlotte's arrival, something like genuine emotion cracked through his careful composure. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but something caught painfully between the two. He set the letter down and rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion settling into his shoulders as the weight of 11 misunderstood years pressed down on him all at once. All this time, I believed he stopped loving me. I built an entire life around that belief, Miss Ashworth. I chose distance because I thought distance was what he wanted. Perhaps, Charlotte said carefully, you were both choosing distance for the same reason, without either of you understanding what the other was protecting. Alexander looked at her sharply, struck by the simplicity and accuracy of her observation. You speak as though you understand grief and silence rather well yourself. I lost my father when I was young, and my mother more recently, Charlotte said, her voice steady, despite the admission. I have learned that silence often carries more love in it than people realize, though it rarely feels that way while you are living inside it. The two of them sat in quiet understanding for a long moment, the letter resting between them on the desk like a bridge neither had expected to build. Alexander studied Charlotte with new eyes now, no longer simply the unexpected messenger who had disrupted his afternoon, but someone tied to his family's history in ways he was only beginning to grasp. There is a final line, Alexander said, returning his attention to the letter. He read it slowly, deliberately, as though testing the weight of each word before releasing it into the room. If you have read this far, then I ask one thing more of you, though I have no right to ask anything at all. Do not let my mistakes become the reason you close yourself off from those who might still love you honestly. I did that to myself for 11 years, and I regret every single one of them. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down for the final time. He looked up at the clock on the mantel, its hands marking the late afternoon hour, and thought again of tomorrow's funeral, the empty chair, the promise he had made only hours ago to stay away entirely. A sharp knock interrupted the quiet before either of them could say more. Collins entered again, his expression tight with a different kind of urgency than before. Forgive me, Your Grace. Lord Henry Beckwith has arrived, and insists on seeing you at once. He says the matter cannot wait until after the funeral. Alexander's jaw tightened at the mention of his cousin's name. Henry Beckwith stood next in line for the dukedom should Alexander ever fail to produce an heir, a fact Henry rarely allowed anyone to forget, least of all Alexander himself. Their relationship had never been warm, but in recent years it had cooled further still, edged with a rivalry Henry seemed far more invested in than Alexander ever had been. Send him away, Collins. I have no patience for Henry's schemes today of all days. He said, Your Grace, that if you refuse to see him, I was to mention that he has already spoken with several members of the family about your absence from tomorrow's service, and that questions are beginning to circulate about your fitness to hold the title at all." Alexander's expression darkened considerably. Charlotte watched the exchange with quiet attentiveness, saying nothing, though her eyes moved between the two men with clear understanding of the tension crackling through the room. "Let him in," Alexander said finally, his voice clipped. Better to face him now than let his poison spread unanswered through the family for another day. Collins withdrew, and moments later, a tall man in fashionable black morning attire strode into the study, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who believed he already held the advantage. Henry's eyes flicked toward Charlotte with open curiosity, before returning to his cousin. "Alexander, I see you have company. How curious. On a day when the entire family gathers to bury your father, and you sit here entertaining a young woman I do not recognize. Miss Ashworth is here on private business, Henry. Say what you came to say and leave." Henry's smile did not waver. "Very well. I came to tell you, cousin, that your continued absence tomorrow will not go unnoticed by the family, nor by the solicitors who will be reviewing matters of inheritance in the weeks that follow. Some might begin to wonder whether a man who cannot honor his own father deserves to carry his father's title. Are you threatening me, Henry? I am simply observing, Alexander, that titles have been contested before, when a duke's conduct raised sufficient doubt about his character. I would hate to see such doubts raised about you, though I confess I would survive the inconvenience rather well, should the title happen to pass elsewhere." Charlotte's expression remained composed, though Alexander noticed her hands tighten slightly in her lap at the implication hanging in the air. He rose slowly from his desk, drawing himself to his full height, and met his cousin's gaze without flinching. "I intend to attend the funeral tomorrow, Henry, and I intend to speak at it. Whatever doubts you hope to plant today, you may consider them uprooted." Something flickered across Henry's face, disappointment poorly disguised as indifference. "How fortunate. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, cousin. I do hope it proves more substantial than the silence you have offered our father for the better part of a decade." He turned and left without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until the front door closed behind him with a sound sharper than necessary. Alexander exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders now that Henry had gone. "My apologies, Miss Ashworth. My cousin has always possessed a talent for arriving at the worst possible moments. He seems very eager for you to fail, Your Grace. Henry has been eager for that for as long as I can remember. My father's title has always meant more to him than it ever did to me, though I confess, until this afternoon, I had given him little reason to doubt my commitment to holding it." Alexander returned to his desk, though he remained standing, restless energy replacing the numbness that had gripped him only an hour before. "I begin to understand now why my father might have kept certain truths close to his chest. A family such as mine does not always reward honesty. Yet you intend to speak honestly tomorrow, regardless of what Henry hopes to gain from your silence." "I do." Alexander looked at her directly now, something resolute settling into his features. "I find I no longer wish to carry forward the same silence that cost my father and myself 11 years we can never reclaim. Miss Ashworth," he said slowly, "I believe I owe you a great deal more gratitude than I have shown you this afternoon." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I only delivered what was asked of me." "You delivered far more than a letter," Alexander said, and for the first time since she had entered his study, something like warmth entered his voice. "You delivered 11 years of truth I did not know I was missing." Charlotte's expression softened, though she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had first caught his attention. "What will you do now, Your Grace?" Alexander looked toward the window once more, watching the last of the daylight fade toward evening, and felt something shift inside him, a decision forming that he had not believed himself capable of making only hours before. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have a funeral to attend tomorrow, and a great deal to say to a man who can no longer hear me, though I intend to say it all the same." Morning arrived gray and heavy with mist, the kind of weather that seemed to settle over London whenever the city itself wished to mourn. Alexander stood before the mirror in his bedchamber, adjusting the black cravat at his throat with hands that were steadier than he expected them to be, given everything the previous day had unearthed. Charlotte had stayed the night in one of the guest rooms at his insistence, a decision that raised more than a few eyebrows among the household staff, though Alexander found he cared little for their opinions on the matter. She had traveled far, arrived exhausted, and delivered something that had reshaped 11 years of his life within the span of a single afternoon. The least he owed her was a roof over her head and a carriage to accompany him to Hampshire in the morning. A soft knock came at his door. "Your Grace, the carriage is ready, and Miss Ashworth is waiting downstairs." Thank you, Collins. I will be down shortly. Alexander took one final look at himself in the mirror, searching his own reflection for some sign of the boy who had once loved his father without complication, before illness and silence had rewritten everything between them. He found only a man of 31, carrying grief he had not permitted himself to feel until yesterday, and a resolve that had not existed in him 24 hours before. He descended the staircase to find Charlotte waiting in the front hall, dressed in the same simple traveling clothes from the day before, though she had clearly done what she could to make herself presentable for the journey ahead. She looked up as he approached, her gray eyes carrying a question she did not voice aloud. "You are certain about this, Your Grace? Once we arrive, there will be no taking back whatever you choose to say." "I have never been more certain of anything," Alexander said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was true. The carriage ride to Hampshire took the better part of 4 hours, and for the first hour, neither of them spoke much, each lost in their own private thoughts as the city gave way to countryside, and countryside gave way to the familiar hills of the estate where Alexander had spent his childhood. It was Charlotte who finally broke the silence, her voice quiet against the rhythmic sound of the carriage wheels. "May I ask you something, Your Grace? Something unrelated to the letter?" "You may." "What was he like, before your mother died? You mentioned once, briefly, that he taught you to ride." Alexander looked out the window for a long moment, watching the familiar landscape pass by, fields he had once raced across as a boy, without a single care weighing on his shoulders. He was patient, unusually so for a man of his position. Most fathers of his rank left such matters to tutors and grooms, but mine insisted on teaching me himself. I remember him laughing when I fell from my pony the first time, not unkindly, but as though my failure amused him more than it worried him. He told me a man who never fell from a horse had never truly learned to ride one. That does not sound like the man Henry described yesterday, nor entirely like the man you described to me before you read the letter. "No," Alexander agreed slowly. "It does not. I had forgotten that man existed until you arrived at my door yesterday and forced me to remember him." He turned from the window to look at Charlotte directly. "What was your mother like? The letter mentioned she was close with mine." Charlotte's expression grew softer, tinged with the particular tenderness reserved for memories of the dead. She was gentle and quick to laugh, though she carried more sadness than she ever let show. "She spoke of your mother often, in her final years, though she never explained the full nature of their friendship. I believed, until yesterday, that they had simply been companions during a season in London, nothing more significant than that. Perhaps there was more to it than either of us understood." "Perhaps," Charlotte agreed. "I find myself wishing I had asked her more questions while she was still able to answer them. It is a strange thing, grief. You do not realize how many questions you meant to ask until the person who could answer them is gone." Alexander studied her for a long moment, struck again by how easily she spoke of loss, without the bitterness or numbness he had carried for most of his own adult life. "You speak of your mother with such warmth, despite losing her so recently. I confess I do not know how to speak of my own father that way, not yet, though I begin to understand I owe him more warmth than I have shown in years. Grief does not follow a single path, Your Grace. Some people find warmth quickly, others find it only after considerable time and difficulty. I do not believe there is a wrong way to grieve someone, so long as you allow yourself to do it honestly." The carriage rounded a final bend, and the Whitmore estate came into view, its gray stone facade rising against the misty morning sky, familiar and yet somehow foreign to Alexander after so many years of deliberate distance. Carriages already lined the drive, family and mourners arriving for the service that would begin within the hour. Alexander's chest tightened at the sight of so many gathered faces, relatives he had not seen in years, family friends whose names he barely remembered, all come to witness either his absence or his unexpected arrival. He caught sight of Henry near the entrance, engaged in quiet conversation with an older woman Alexander recognized as his father's sister, Aunt Beatrice. Henry's expression shifted the moment he spotted the approaching carriage, surprise quickly masked by careful composure. "He did not expect you to come," Charlotte observed quietly. "No," Alexander agreed. "I imagine he did not." The carriage came to a stop, and Alexander stepped down first, offering his hand to help Charlotte descend after him. The gesture drew immediate attention from the gathered mourners, whispers rippling through the crowd as the Duke, who had sworn never to attend, now walked toward the estate's entrance with an unfamiliar young woman at his side. Aunt Beatrice approached first, her expression a complicated mixture of relief and confusion. "Alexander, we had heard you would not be joining us today." "I changed my mind, Aunt Beatrice. Alexander's voice remained steady despite the weight of dozens of curious eyes now fixed upon him. There were things I needed to understand before I could properly say goodbye to my father, and I have Miss Ashworth to thank for helping me understand them. Beatrice's gaze moved to Charlotte with obvious curiosity, though her manners prevented her from asking the questions clearly forming behind her eyes. Miss Ashworth, I do not believe we have met. We have not, my lady, Charlotte replied with quiet composure, though I believe your late brother knew my mother rather well. Something shifted in Beatrice's expression, a flicker of recognition that told Alexander this connection between his father and Charlotte's mother might extend further into the family's history than even the letter had revealed. Before he could ask, however, the church bells began to toll, signaling that the service was about to begin. We should go in, Alexander said, though his mind was already racing with new questions he had not anticipated only moments before. The chapel interior felt smaller than Alexander remembered, packed now with mourners filling every pew, the air thick with the scent of lilies and burning candles. Edmund Whitmore's casket rested at the front, draped in black cloth bearing the family crest, and Alexander felt his throat tighten at the sight of it, a wave of grief finally breaking through the numbness he had carried since receiving the news of his father's death. Charlotte took a seat near the back of the chapel, insisting Alexander sit with the family despite his protest that she should join him. He made his way toward the front pew, aware of Henry's watchful gaze following his every step, and settled into the seat reserved for the eldest son, a seat that had remained conspicuously empty in the planning of this service, until his unexpected arrival forced a hurried adjustment. The vicar began the service with familiar words about mortality and mercy, words Alexander had heard at countless funerals throughout his life, without truly absorbing their meaning. Today, however, each phrase seemed to strike something deep within him, memories of his father surfacing unbidden, the sound of his laughter in the meadow, the careful way he had once bandaged a scraped knee, the warmth that had existed before grief and secrecy had buried it beneath 11 years of silence. When the vicar finished his prepared remarks, he turned toward the gathered mourners with a question that had clearly been anticipated by everyone present except Alexander himself. Does anyone wish to speak in memory of Duke Edmund Whitmore? Silence stretched through the chapel. Alexander felt Henry's eyes on him from across the aisle, watching, waiting, perhaps hoping for continued silence that would confirm every doubt he had planted the day before. Alexander thought of the letter resting now in his coat pocket, of 11 years spent believing his father had simply stopped loving him, of the truth Charlotte had carried across the countryside to correct that painful misunderstanding before it was buried alongside his father forever. He rose slowly to his feet. Murmurs rippled through the chapel as Alexander made his way to the front, standing beside his father's casket for the first time since arriving. He looked out over the gathered faces, family members and friends and rivals alike, and found Charlotte's steady gray eyes near the back of the room, offering silent encouragement. I did not intend to speak today, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chapel. In truth, I did not intend to come here at all, and I imagine that fact is no secret to anyone gathered in this room. A few uncomfortable shifts rippled through the pews, though no one interrupted him. For 11 years I believed my father had stopped loving me, though I could never understand why. I believed his silence was a judgment on some failure of mine, some disappointment I had caused without knowing it, and I let that belief harden into resentment I carried for far longer than I should have. Alexander paused, his gaze drifting briefly toward his father's casket before continuing. Yesterday, I learned the truth was far different and far more painful than the resentment I had chosen instead. My father did not stop loving me. He made an impossible promise to my dying mother, one that cost him the closeness we once shared, because he believed silence would protect me from a grief he thought I could not bear to carry. Whispers spread through the gathered mourners now, confusion and surprise mixing openly on several faces. Henry's expression had gone carefully blank, though Alexander could see the calculation still working behind his cousin's eyes. I do not say this to excuse 11 years of silence between us, nor to pretend that silence did not cause real harm to us both. I say it because I believe my father deserves to be remembered honestly, not as a cold and distant man, but as someone who made an impossible choice out of love, however flawed that choice may have been. Alexander's voice grew steadier as he continued, years of carefully suppressed emotion finding release in words he had not planned to say until moments before speaking them. He taught me to ride a horse in the meadow behind our home. He laughed when I fell, not unkindly, but because he wanted me to understand that falling was simply part of learning. I had forgotten that man for over a decade, buried beneath grief and misunderstanding neither of us knew how to overcome. I do not wish to bury him again today, alongside the body we have come to lay to rest." He looked out at the gathered faces one final time, his eyes finding Charlotte's again near the back of the chapel. "I am grateful, more than I can properly express, to the person who ensured I understood this truth before it was too late to say any of it aloud. My father asked, in his final letter to me, that I not let his mistakes become the reason I close myself off from those who might still love me honestly. I intend to honor that request, starting today." Alexander returned to his seat amid a silence that felt entirely different from the one that had greeted his rise only minutes before, heavier now with shared understanding rather than uncomfortable confusion. Beatrice reached over and squeezed his hand gently as he sat down, tears visible in her eyes that had not been there before his speech began. The remainder of the service passed in a blur, hymns and final prayers carrying the assembled mourners through the last formal moments of farewell. When it finally ended, the crowd began filing slowly toward the churchyard for burial, and Alexander found himself intercepted by Henry before he could follow. "That was quite a performance, cousin," Henry said, his voice pitched low enough that only Alexander could hear it. "Very moving. I wonder how much of it was true, and how much was crafted to salvage your reputation after yesterday's scandalous refusal became common knowledge. Believe what you wish, Henry. I have nothing left to prove to you." "Perhaps not to me," Henry said, glancing meaningfully toward where Charlotte now stood near the chapel entrance, watching their exchange with quiet wariness. "But I wonder if the rest of the family will be quite so understanding, once they learn more about your mysterious Miss Ashworth, and the true nature of her connection to our late uncle." Alexander's expression hardened. "What are you implying, Henry?" "I imply nothing, cousin. I merely observe that a young woman appearing from nowhere, carrying secret letters and secret histories, tends to raise questions in families such as ours. Questions that solicitors and courts have been known to take rather seriously, when matters of inheritance and legitimacy come into play." Before Alexander could respond, Henry turned and walked away toward the churchyard, leaving the implication hanging heavy and unresolved in the cold morning air. Alexander watched him go, a new unease settling into his chest that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the growing sense that Charlotte's presence in his life carried complications neither of them had yet fully understood. He found Charlotte waiting near the chapel entrance, her expression carrying the particular stillness of someone who had overheard at least part of the exchange, even if she could not have caught every word. "Your cousin does not care for me very much, it seems." "My cousin does not care for anyone who might interfere with his ambitions," Alexander said, though he could not fully mask the concern threading through his voice. "He suggested there might be questions raised about your connection to my father, about legitimacy and inheritance." Charlotte's composure did not break, though something careful entered her expression, the look of someone who had considered this possibility long before Henry gave voice to it. "I feared he might say something of the sort. It is a natural assumption, Your Grace, given the circumstances of my arrival. A young woman, unknown to the family, carrying secret letters from a dying duke. I imagine it looks rather suspicious from the outside." "Is there truth to what he implies?" Alexander asked, and immediately regretted the bluntness of the question when he saw the flicker of hurt cross Charlotte's face. "No, Your Grace. Whatever your father was to my mother, and whatever debt he felt he owed her, I assure you it was not the kind Henry hopes to suggest. My mother married my father when I was an infant, and I have never known any other man to call father in my life, save for the man we buried today, who showed my family kindness without ever asking for anything in return." Alexander studied her face carefully, searching for any hint of deception, and found only the same steady honesty that had characterized every word she had spoken since arriving at his door the previous afternoon. "Forgive me for asking. I did not mean to suggest I doubted you. Henry has a talent for planting seeds of suspicion in even the steadiest minds, and I fear I allowed his words to take root before I had properly considered them. There is nothing to forgive, Your Grace. It is a reasonable question given how little we truly know of each other, despite everything we have shared in so short a time." They walked together toward the churchyard, where the remaining mourners had gathered around the open grave, the vicar preparing final words for the burial itself. Alexander found himself standing beside Charlotte rather than among his family, a positioning that did not go unnoticed by the watchful eyes still tracking his every movement, though he found he cared little for their scrutiny now. As the casket was lowered into the earth, Alexander felt the last of his numbness give way entirely to genuine grief. Tears he had not permitted himself to shed since childhood finally spilling freely down his face. Charlotte said nothing, offering only her quiet presence beside him, a steadiness he found he needed more than he could have anticipated only 2 days before. When the burial concluded and the mourners began dispersing toward the estate for the customary gathering afterward, Aunt Beatrice approached once more, her expression thoughtful as she studied both Alexander and Charlotte together. "Walk with me a moment, Alexander," she said quietly. "There are things about your mother, and about Margaret Ashworth, that I believe you and Miss Ashworth both deserve to hear. Things your father never found the courage to share while he lived." Alexander exchanged a glance with Charlotte, whose expression had shifted from grief to something closer to apprehension. Whatever Beatrice intended to reveal, it seemed the truth contained in his father's letter had only been the beginning of a much larger story neither of them had yet fully uncovered. Aunt Beatrice led them away from the gathering crowd, toward a quiet sitting room at the rear of the estate that overlooked the same garden Alexander's mother had once tended with her own hands. The room smelled faintly of old books and dried lavender, undisturbed for years by the look of the dust settled across its furnishings. "Sit, both of you," Beatrice said, lowering herself into a worn armchair near the window. "What I am about to tell you should have been shared long ago, by someone with more courage than your father possessed on this particular matter." Alexander took a seat beside Charlotte on a small settee, apprehension building in his chest at the gravity in his aunt's voice. "You knew about the letter, about what he revealed to me?" "I knew of its existence, though not its exact contents. Edmund confided in me only that he intended to explain himself to you eventually, though he kept delaying, year after year, until illness finally forced his hand." Beatrice's gaze shifted to Charlotte. "But there is more to this story than your mother's illness, Alexander, and it concerns your Miss Ashworth rather directly." Charlotte straightened slightly, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "My lady, please, whatever you know, I would rather hear it plainly than have it delivered in careful pieces." Beatrice nodded, appreciating the directness. "Very well. Margaret Ashworth was not simply your mother's companion, Charlotte. Every screen. She was her cousin, though a distant and disgraced branch of the family that your grandmother refused to acknowledge publicly. Margaret's own mother had married beneath her station, scandalously so by the standards of the time, and the family severed all connection, rather than suffer the embarrassment of association." Charlotte's face had gone pale, her composure cracking for the first time since Alexander had met her the previous day. "I did not know this. My mother never spoke of any connection to a titled family. She would not have." The shame ran deep enough that even mentioning it was forbidden within her own household growing up. But when Margaret came to London as a young woman, she and your mother, Alexander, found each other despite the family's efforts to keep the branches separated. They became close, closer than sisters in many ways, and remained so even after Margaret married and moved away. Alexander absorbed this revelation slowly, pieces of the puzzle shifting once again into new and unexpected shapes. "So Charlotte is not merely connected to my mother through friendship. She is family, however distant and however deliberately forgotten. Distant cousins, yes, several times removed through the female line, which is precisely why the connection was so easily buried and forgotten by those who preferred not to acknowledge it." Beatrice's expression grew somber. "Your father knew all of this, Alexander. He knew it when he first offered assistance to Margaret after her husband's death, and he knew it when your mother, in her final illness, asked him to look after the family she had been forbidden from claiming publicly. Why keep it secret even after my mother's death? What purpose did it serve to hide something so far in the past?" Beatrice sighed heavily. "Pride, Alexander. The same pride that has plagued this family for generations. Your grandmother was still alive when your mother passed, and she made it clear that any public acknowledgement of the Ashworth branch would bring shame upon the family name she had worked so hard to protect. Your father honored that wish, even after your grandmother's own death some years later, out of habit as much as conviction, I suspect." Charlotte sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that reshaped not only her understanding of her mother's history, but her own place within a family she had never known existed. "Then the kindness your father showed us was not simply gratitude toward my mother's friendship with the Duchess. It was an acknowledgement of blood he was forbidden from speaking aloud." "Precisely," Beatrice confirmed. "I believe, in his own quiet way, Edmund was trying to correct a wrong that predated even his own marriage, though he lacked the courage to do so openly, while facing the judgment of a family still clinging to old prejudices." Alexander turned to Charlotte, searching her face for some sign of how this new truth had settled within her. "This changes things considerably. You are not merely a messenger who arrived at my door with a letter, Miss Ashworth. You are family, however distant, however deliberately hidden." "I do not know how to feel about that," Charlotte admitted quietly. "For so long I believed my mother's family had simply died out, or perhaps never existed beyond the small circle we knew. To learn now that an entire branch was cut away deliberately, and that I carry that severed connection within me, is difficult to absorb all at once. You need not absorb it all at once, Alexander said gently. But I would like, if you are willing, to acknowledge this connection properly, rather than allow it to remain buried the way my father and grandmother once insisted it should be. Beatrice watched the exchange between them with quiet interest, something knowing entering her expression that neither Alexander nor Charlotte seemed to notice in the moment. There is one more matter I feel obligated to mention, though I confess it is speculation on my part, based on conversations I had with your father in his final months. What matter? Alexander asked. Your father spoke of you often in those final months, Charlotte, in ways that went beyond simple obligation or family debt. He mentioned your character, your resilience following your mother's death, and once, though only once, he wondered aloud whether you and Alexander might find something worthwhile in each other's company, should circumstances ever bring you together. Beatrice's expression carried the faintest hint of amusement despite the solemnity of the day. I did not think much of the comment at the time. I confess I think rather more of it now, watching the two of you together. Charlotte's cheeks colored slightly, and Alexander found himself equally caught off guard by his aunt's frank observation. My lady, I hardly think this is the appropriate moment to discuss such matters, given the circumstances of our meeting. Perhaps not, Beatrice agreed, though her knowing expression did not fully fade. But I have learned at my age that appropriate moments rarely announce themselves clearly, and life has a way of arranging its most important conversations at precisely the times we least expect them. A knock interrupted the conversation before either Alexander or Charlotte could respond. Collins entered, his expression tight with concern. Your Grace, forgive the interruption. Lord Henry has gathered several family members in the drawing room, and he is making claims regarding Miss Ashworth's presence here that I believe require your immediate attention. Alexander rose immediately, his earlier grief giving way to sharp alertness. What sort of claims, Collins? He suggests, Your Grace, that Miss Ashworth's connection to your family is more scandalous than has been disclosed, and that her presence at the funeral, and now at the estate, raises questions about the legitimacy of certain inheritance matters that the family solicitors should investigate before any documents are finalized. Beatrice rose as well, her expression hardening with the particular fury of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of family politics. Henry has chosen a remarkably poor day to stir such trouble. Come, both of you. It seems we have a conversation to finish rather more publicly than I intended. Alexander offered his hand to Charlotte, who took it without hesitation this time, and together they followed Beatrice toward the drawing room, where Henry's voice could already be heard through the closed doors, spinning a narrative that bore little resemblance to the truth Alexander had just learned. I do not know what awaits us in that room, Alexander said quietly as they approached, but I promise you, I will not allow Henry's ambitions to rewrite the truth my father spent his final months trying to reveal. Charlotte's grip on his hand tightened slightly, a small gesture that carried more reassurance than either of them could have properly expressed aloud in the tense moments before the doors opened before them. Collins pushed the doors open, and the drawing room fell into an immediate hush as every face turned toward the entrance. A dozen or more relatives had gathered, teacups abandoned on side tables, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Henry stood near the fireplace, mid-sentence, and his composure flickered only briefly at the sight of Alexander and Charlotte arriving together, hand in hand. Ah, cousin, Henry said, recovering quickly, his tone light despite the tension threading beneath it. We were just discussing the rather unusual circumstances surrounding Miss Ashworth's involvement in our family's affairs. Perhaps you can shed some light on the matter yourself, since you seem so reluctant to let her out of your sight. I would be glad to, Henry, since it seems you have been spreading half-formed speculation in my absence. Alexander's voice carried clearly across the room, steady despite the dozens of eyes now fixed upon him. Miss Ashworth is not a stranger seeking to exploit this family's grief, as you have apparently been suggesting. She is family, however distant, and however deliberately hidden by choices made 2 generations before either of us was born. Murmurs rippled through the gathered relatives. Henry's expression tightened, though he attempted to maintain his composure. Family, you say? Rather convenient timing for such a discovery, given the matters of inheritance currently under review by the solicitors. It is not a discovery I sought out for convenience, Henry, nor one I welcomed with any particular relish, given how it forces me to confront yet another example of this family's willingness to bury uncomfortable truths rather than face them honestly. Alexander's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of relatives who had known him since childhood, cousins and aunts and uncles who had gathered today ostensibly to honor his father's memory. Miss Ashworth's mother, Margaret, was cousin to my own mother, through a branch of the family severed generations ago over a marriage deemed unsuitable by standards I find increasingly difficult to respect. Aunt Beatrice stepped forward now, adding her own voice to the growing tension. I can confirm every word Alexander has spoken. I knew Margaret myself, briefly, before circumstances separated the families entirely. The connection is real, and the shame that caused its severing belongs to this family's past choices, not to Miss Ashworth's character or intentions. Henry's composure finally cracked, frustration bleeding through his carefully maintained expression. Even if what you say is true, it changes nothing regarding the timing of her arrival, nor the influence she has clearly gained over you in the span of a single day. Alexander, forgive me for finding that circumstance rather difficult to accept at face value. You may find it difficult to accept whatever you wish, Henry, Alexander replied, his voice hardening further. But I will not stand here and allow you to slander a woman who has done nothing but honor a dying man's final wish, simply because her presence complicates your own ambitions regarding this family's title. The accusation landed heavily in the crowded room, and several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly aware of the rivalry that had long simmered beneath the surface of Henry and Alexander's relationship. Henry's jaw tightened, color rising in his face, as the assembled family's attention shifted subtly against him. I have no ambitions beyond seeing this family's name protected from scandal, Henry said stiffly, though the words carried less conviction than before. Then perhaps, Beatrice interjected sharply, you might consider that continuing to slander an innocent young woman in front of the entire family, on the day of your uncle's funeral, does rather more damage to this family's name than anything Miss Ashworth's presence could ever cause. A heavy silence followed, broken finally by an older gentleman Alexander recognized as a distant cousin from his father's side. I believe Beatrice speaks sense, Henry. Whatever concerns you have regarding inheritance matters, this is neither the time nor the place to air them so publicly, especially against a guest who has offered no offense beyond her presence here today. Henry looked around the room, gauging the shifting mood among the gathered relatives, and seemed to recognize that his earlier confidence had eroded considerably in the span of a few short minutes. He straightened his coat with forced dignity. Very well. I will withdraw my concerns for today, out of respect for my uncle's memory, though I maintain the solicitors should review the matter thoroughly before any final decisions are made regarding inheritance and title. The solicitors are welcome to review whatever they wish, Henry, Alexander said evenly. I have nothing to hide, and neither, I am quite certain, does Miss Ashworth. Henry offered a stiff nod and departed the drawing room without further comment, his earlier bravado considerably diminished. The gathered relatives slowly returned to quieter conversation, though the atmosphere remained charged with the residue of the confrontation that had just unfolded before them. Charlotte released a breath she had clearly been holding, her hand still clasped in Alexander's. That was rather more public than I anticipated, Your Grace. I apologize for subjecting you to it, Alexander said quietly, leading her toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the remaining curious eyes. Henry has never been one to concede ground easily, even when the truth stands clearly against him. You need not apologize. I would rather face the truth publicly than continue living beneath the shadow of suspicion. Henry seemed eager to cast over both of us. Charlotte's gaze met his, steady despite the exhaustion visible beneath her composure. Though I confess, this day has brought rather more revelations than I anticipated when I set out from Hampshire yesterday morning. For both of us, Alexander agreed. I began yesterday believing my father had stopped loving me, and I end today discovering that the woman who delivered that truth is family I never knew existed, family my own relatives are prepared to fight rather than acknowledge. Aunt Beatrice approached once more, her expression thoughtful as she studied the two of them together. For what it is worth, Alexander, I believe your father would be rather pleased with how you have handled today, difficult as it has been. He spent 11 years avoiding difficult truths. You have faced several of them within the span of 2 days, and faced them with considerably more courage than he ever managed. Alexander looked toward the window, where afternoon light had begun softening toward evening once more, marking the end of a day that had reshaped nearly everything he believed about his family, his father, and now, increasingly, about the woman standing quietly beside him. 3 weeks passed before Henry's threat resurfaced in a form far more serious than gossip whispered in a crowded drawing room. Alexander received the summons from his solicitor on a gray Tuesday morning, a formal letter requesting his presence at the firm's London offices to discuss, in the solicitor's careful legal language, matters pertaining to the recent addition of an unrelated party to discussions of estate management. Charlotte had remained in London these past weeks, staying at a respectable boarding house arranged by Alexander after considerable insistence on his part, though she had firmly declined his offer of rooms within his own townhouse, citing propriety concerns neither of them wished to argue against too strenuously. In that time, something had grown steadily between them: quiet conversations over tea, long walks through the city's parks, a familiarity that neither had quite named aloud, though both seemed increasingly aware of its presence. Alexander arrived at the solicitor's offices to find Henry already seated in the waiting room, along with a stern-faced older man Alexander did not immediately recognize. "Alexander," Henry said, rising with a politeness that did not fully mask the satisfaction beneath it. "May I introduce Mr. Pemberton, a solicitor specializing in matters of inheritance and legitimacy. I took the liberty of engaging his services, given the complexity of the concerns I raised at the funeral." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You engaged outside counsel to investigate my private affairs, Henry, without my knowledge or consent?" "I engaged counsel to protect this family's interests," Henry replied smoothly. "Interests that extend beyond your private affairs, cousin, given that the title and estate in question will one day pass to whichever heir you or fate determines, and given the rather sudden and public elevation of Miss Ashworth's standing within our family circle." Mr. Pratt, Alexander's own long-serving solicitor, emerged from his office at that moment, his expression carrying visible displeasure at finding Henry's hired counsel already present. "Your Grace, I apologize. I was not informed that Lord Beckwith intended to bring additional representation to what I understood would be a private consultation. It seems my cousin has been busy in the weeks since the funeral," Alexander said dryly. "Very well. Let us hear what concerns Mr. Pemberton believes require formal attention." They moved into Mr. Pratt's office, where Pemberton laid out his concerns with the careful precision of a man accustomed to building cases from fragments of circumstantial evidence. He questioned the timing of Charlotte's arrival, the sudden revelation of a previously unknown family connection, the speed with which Alexander had embraced her presence in his life, and suggested, with practiced diplomacy, that such circumstances warranted formal investigation before any further public acknowledgement of the relationship took place. "You are suggesting Miss Ashworth fabricated her connection to my family," Alexander said flatly, once Pemberton finished his careful presentation. "I suggest nothing definitively, Your Grace. I merely observed that unverified family connections, appearing conveniently after a duke's death and directly influencing decisions regarding his estate, have historically warranted careful scrutiny in matters of English law. The connection has already been confirmed by my aunt, who knew Margaret Ashworth personally," Alexander said, frustration creeping into his controlled tone. "What further verification do you require?" Pemberton folded his hands neatly atop the desk. "Personal recollection from a single family member, however well-intentioned, does not constitute formal documentation, Your Grace. I would recommend, at minimum, examination of parish records, marriage certificates, and any correspondence that might substantiate the claimed relationship beyond doubt." Henry leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident despite his attempt at neutral composure. "It seems a reasonable request, Alexander, given the stakes involved. Surely you have nothing to fear from thorough verification, if the connection is as genuine as you and Aunt Beatrice believe it to be." Alexander studied his cousin for a long moment, recognizing the strategy unfolding before him with growing clarity. Henry did not necessarily believe Charlotte's connection was false. He simply hoped that prolonged investigation, formal scrutiny, and public doubt would erode Alexander's standing and reputation enough to weaken his position, regardless of what the eventual verification might reveal. "Very well," Alexander said finally. "Pursue whatever verification you believe necessary, Mr. Pemberton. I have nothing to hide, and I trust the records will confirm precisely what my aunt has already told us." The meeting concluded with arrangements made for the necessary research to begin, though the atmosphere remained tense as Alexander and Henry departed the offices separately, each retreating to consider their next moves in what had clearly become a more prolonged conflict than either had initially anticipated. Alexander made his way directly to Charlotte's boarding house that afternoon, finding her in the small parlor reserved for receiving guests, a book resting unread in her lap as though she had been waiting, watching for his arrival. "You look troubled," she observed immediately, setting the book aside as he entered. "Henry has engaged a solicitor to investigate your family connection," Alexander said, taking the seat across from her without preamble. "He questions whether the relationship is genuine, or whether it has been fabricated somehow to influence matters of inheritance." Charlotte's expression remained composed, though Alexander could see the effort it took to maintain that steadiness. I suppose I should have anticipated this. Henry seems determined to find some avenue of attack, regardless of how many times the truth stands against him. I am sorry to bring you further trouble. This began with a letter meant to heal a rift between myself and my father, and now it has become a battle over documents and legal standing that has nothing to do with either of our grief. You need not apologize for Henry's ambitions, Your Grace. Though I confess, the prospect of strangers examining my family's history, searching for any flaw they might exploit, is rather more unsettling than I expected it to be. Charlotte's hands twisted slightly in her lap, the first visible sign of genuine anxiety Alexander had witnessed from her since their first meeting weeks before. We will face it together, Alexander said, and found, as he spoke the words, that he meant them with a certainty that surprised him. Whatever records Pemberton uncovers, I trust they will confirm exactly what Beatrice has already told us. And if Henry hopes to use this investigation to damage either of our reputations in the meantime, he will find I am rather more prepared to fight for what matters now than I once was. Charlotte looked up at him, something soft and uncertain crossing her features. You have changed a great deal in these past weeks, Your Grace. The man who refused to attend his own father's funeral seems very distant now from the man sitting before me. I owe that change entirely to you, Alexander said quietly. You arrived at my door with a letter I did not wish to read, and somehow, in the span of a single afternoon, you gave me back 11 years I believed were lost forever. I find I am rather unwilling to let Henry's schemes take away what we have built since then. The following days passed in a flurry of activity as Pemberton's investigation unfolded. Parish records examined, correspondence between Alexander's mother and Margaret Ashworth located and verified, marriage certificates confirming the family connection precisely as Beatrice had described it weeks before. Yet even as the documentation mounted in Charlotte's favor, Henry continued spreading subtle doubt through London's social circles. Careful comments dropped at gatherings, questions raised in tones that suggested concern rather than accusation, slowly eroding the goodwill Alexander's public speech at the funeral had initially earned. 3 weeks into the investigation, matters came to a head at a gathering hosted by Aunt Beatrice, intended originally as a small family dinner but which Henry had somehow expanded into a larger social event, inviting members of London society whose opinions carried considerable weight within the ton. Alexander arrived with Charlotte at his side, aware immediately of the whispered conversations that quieted as they entered the drawing room, dozens of curious eyes tracking their arrival with the particular hunger reserved for society's most compelling scandals. Henry stood near the center of the room, engaged in animated conversation with several prominent guests, and his expression shifted with poorly concealed satisfaction as Alexander and Charlotte made their entrance. "Alexander, cousin, how good of you to join us," Henry called out, his voice carrying deliberately across the room. "And Miss Ashworth as well. I trust the investigation into your family history has proven as illuminating as we all hoped." And the pointed emphasis on the word illuminating drew several curious glances toward Charlotte, who maintained her composure despite the obvious discomfort of becoming the evening's central topic of speculation. Alexander felt anger rising sharply in his chest, though he forced himself to respond with careful control rather than the fury Henry clearly hoped to provoke. "The investigation has proven precisely what my aunt told us weeks ago, Henry. Parish records, marriage certificates, and personal correspondence all confirm Miss Ashworth's connection to my mother's family beyond any reasonable doubt. Mr. Pemberton's final report should reach us within the week." A murmur of interest rippled through the gathered guests, and Alexander caught sight of Beatrice near the fireplace, her expression carrying quiet approval at his measured response. Henry, however, seemed undeterred, pressing forward with a smile that had grown increasingly strained as the weeks progressed without the scandal he had clearly hoped to manufacture. "How fortunate for Miss Ashworth," Henry said, his tone carrying a thin edge of mockery beneath its surface politeness. "Though I confess, cousin, even confirmed family connections do not entirely address certain questions regarding the remarkable speed of your attachment to her. One might almost suspect calculation, rather than genuine sentiment, guiding such a swift and convenient romance." The room fell into uncomfortable silence, several guests exchanging glances as they awaited Alexander's response to an accusation delivered with far less subtlety than Henry had employed in previous weeks. Charlotte's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against Alexander's arm, though her expression remained carefully neutral despite the public nature of the insult. Alexander felt something settle within him then, a clarity that had been building steadily throughout the weeks of investigation, and quiet doubt Henry had worked so persistently to sow. He turned to face his cousin directly, his voice carrying clearly enough that every guest in the room could hear his response without difficulty. You have spent 3 weeks, Henry, attempting to manufacture scandal from grief and suspicion from truth. I have allowed it, out of respect for the family gathering we shared at my father's funeral, and out of patience for whatever fears drive your continued campaign against a woman who has done nothing beyond honoring a dying man's final wish. That patience has now run its course. Henry's confident expression faltered slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure before the watching guests. I merely raise reasonable questions, Alexander. Questions any concerned family member might raise under similar circumstances. You raise questions you already know the answers to, Henry, because you fear what those answers mean for your own position within this family. Should I choose to marry where my heart has led me, rather than where convenience or family expectation might otherwise dictate? Alexander's words landed heavily in the silent room, and he felt Charlotte's sharp intake of breath beside him at the implication carried within them. Are you suggesting, Henry said slowly, his composure cracking further, that you intend to marry this woman, despite the scandal such a match would surely provoke? Alexander turned to Charlotte then, taking her hand fully in his own before the assembled crowd, and found in her wide, startled eyes not rejection of the moment unfolding, but something closer to hope she had perhaps not allowed herself to voice aloud until this precise moment. I intend, Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed drawing room, to marry Miss Ashworth, if she will have me, regardless of whatever scandal my cousin hopes to manufacture around a connection that is proven, at every turn, to be built on truth rather than calculation. The room erupted into astonished whispers, and Henry stood frozen amid the chaos he had inadvertently provoked, his careful campaign against Charlotte's legitimacy collapsing entirely beneath the weight of Alexander's public declaration. Charlotte's eyes remained fixed on Alexander's face, searching for confirmation that the words he had just spoken before all of London society carried the same sincerity she had come to recognize in him over these past weeks of shared grief and growing understanding. Your Grace, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the surrounding murmurs. Are you certain? This is hardly the setting either of us imagined for such a question. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Alexander replied, his eyes never leaving hers despite the dozens of watching faces surrounding them. You arrived at my door 3 weeks ago, carrying a truth that changed everything I believed about my father, and about myself. I find I am no longer willing to let fear or scandal, or my cousin's ambitions stand between us and whatever future we might build together. Charlotte's composure finally broke, tears gathering in her eyes as a smile spread slowly across her face, genuine and unguarded in a way Alexander had not yet witnessed from her since their first meeting. Then, yes, Your Grace. I will have you, scandal and all, though I suspect your cousin will find rather less satisfaction in this evening's outcome than he had hoped. Around them, the gathered guests began applauding despite the unconventional nature of the proposal, swept up in the drama and romance of the moment, despite whatever reservations Henry's earlier insinuations might have planted. Henry himself slipped quietly from the room amid the commotion, his campaign against Charlotte's legitimacy now thoroughly and publicly defeated by the very declaration he had hoped to prevent. Aunt Beatrice approached moments later, tears of her own visible despite her attempt at dignified composure. Well, she said, embracing Alexander briefly, before turning to Charlotte with equal warmth. I confess I did not expect my nephew's proposal to arrive quite so publicly, though I cannot say I am surprised it arrived at all. I suspected as much weeks ago, if you recall. You did mention something of the sort, my lady, Charlotte replied, laughter mixing with the tears still gathered in her eyes, though I hardly expected it to prove prophetic within a month of our first meeting. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and curious questions from guests eager to understand the sudden turn of events, though Alexander found he cared little for satisfying society's curiosity beyond the truth he had already spoken so plainly before them. When the gathering finally began to disperse, he escorted Charlotte to her waiting carriage, lingering a moment longer than propriety strictly demanded before releasing her hand. Henry will not simply accept tonight's defeat quietly, Alexander said, his earlier joy tempered now by practical concern. I know my cousin well enough to expect further attempts to disrupt whatever happiness we hope to build. Then we will face them as we have faced everything else these past weeks, Charlotte replied, her earlier tears giving way to quiet determination. Together, and honestly, rather than hiding from whatever truths he hopes to twist against us. Alexander watched her carriage depart into the London evening, a lightness in his chest he had not felt in years, tempered only by the certain knowledge that Henry's wounded pride would not allow tonight's public humiliation to pass without some final attempt at retaliation. He returned to his own carriage lost in thought, already beginning to consider what shape that final confrontation might take, and how he intended to meet it when it inevitably arrived. He did not have long to wait. A note arrived at his townhouse the following morning, delivered by a messenger who refused to identify his employer, containing only a brief and unsettling warning written in a hand Alexander did not immediately recognize. Some truths, once buried, are better left undisturbed, for everyone's sake. Alexander stared at the note for a long moment, an uneasy feeling settling into his chest that Henry's defeat the previous evening might not mark the end of their conflict, but merely the beginning of something far more dangerous than mere gossip and social scrutiny. He summoned Collins immediately, showing him the note and asking whether any visitors had called that morning, or whether anyone unfamiliar had been seen near the house. Collins confirmed only that the note had been left by a young boy paid a small coin to deliver it, gone before anyone thought to question him further. Alexander folded the note carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, though the unsettled feeling it provoked remained with him throughout the day, a quiet undercurrent of worry beneath the joy of the previous evening's declaration. He considered showing the note to Charlotte, then reconsidered, unwilling to disturb her happiness so soon after finally securing it, at least not until he understood more clearly what threat, if any, the warning actually represented. Instead, he sent word to Mr. Pratt, requesting the solicitor look further into Henry's recent activities and associations, sensing that his cousin's wounded pride might have driven him toward alliances or actions considerably more reckless than mere social scheming. That evening, as Alexander sat alone in his study reviewing the day's correspondence, he found himself returning again and again to Beatrice's earlier words, that Edmund had spent 11 years avoiding difficult truths, only to leave them unfinished at his death. He wondered now whether his father's caution had extended beyond simply protecting Alexander from grief, whether some further secret, buried even deeper than the one already revealed, remained waiting to surface at precisely the moment Alexander felt most secure in the happiness he had finally found. The answer to the note's warning arrived sooner than Alexander expected, though not in the form he anticipated. Mr. Pratt appeared at his townhouse 3 days later, his expression grave as he was shown into the study, a thin folder clutched in his hands. "Your Grace, I believe I have uncovered the source of the warning you received, though the truth behind it is rather more complicated than simple malice on Lord Beckwith's part." Alexander gestured for him to sit, his earlier unease sharpening into full attention. "Tell me." "In the course of investigating Henry's recent associations, I discovered he had engaged not only Mr. Pemberton for the inheritance investigation, but also a private inquiry agent, tasked with examining matters considerably more sensitive than parish records and marriage certificates." Pratt opened the folder, extracting several pages of careful notes. "It seems Henry uncovered information regarding your mother's final illness that extends beyond what your father's letter revealed to you, Your Grace." Alexander's chest tightened. "What information?" "The physician who attended your mother in her final months, a Dr. Whitfield, kept detailed records of her condition. Records your father apparently paid considerable sums to keep private, even from his own family. Henry's agent located Dr. Whitfield's surviving journals, sold by his estate after his death some years ago, and has been reviewing them for anything that might further discredit either yourself or Miss Ashworth. What do the journals reveal, Mr. Pratt?" Pratt hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver whatever news the pages contained. "They confirm your father's account of your mother's illness of the mind, Your Grace, though they add considerable detail your father chose to omit from his letter. It seems your mother's condition worsened significantly in her final weeks, to the point where Dr. Whitfield recommended she be moved to a private institution for her own safety and that of the household." Alexander felt his stomach turn. "My father refused. He refused absolutely, according to the journal, insisting she remain at home under private care rather than face the shame and stigma such an institution would have brought upon the family, and upon her memory afterward. He nursed her himself, alongside a small trusted staff, through her final decline, at considerable personal cost to his own health and reputation among physicians who believed his refusal reckless." The weight of this new information settled heavily over Alexander, reshaping once again his understanding of the father he had spent 11 years resenting. "He protected her dignity, even at the cost of his own well-being, and then protected me from the full truth of her suffering, even at the cost of our relationship. It would seem so, Your Grace." Pratt's expression softened slightly. "Whatever judgment history might pass on his methods, I do not believe your father's motives, in this matter at least, were ever anything but love, however imperfectly expressed. And Henry intends to use this information how, exactly?" Pratt's expression grew graver still. "He believes, Your Grace, that public knowledge of your mother's condition, combined with questions about Miss Ashworth's sudden prominence in your life, might be sufficient to raise doubts about your own fitness to hold the title, suggesting perhaps that whatever afflicted your mother's mind might pose similar risk to yourself, and that a controversial marriage taken so quickly after your father's death only strengthens such doubts in the eyes of those inclined toward suspicion. Alexander rose from his desk, anger and disbelief warring within him at the calculated cruelty of his cousin's scheme. He intends to use my mother's suffering and my father's grief as weapons to seize a title he has coveted his entire life. I believe that is precisely his intention, Your Grace, though I would caution that acting rashly against him now, without careful strategy, may only strengthen whatever narrative he hopes to construct. Alexander forced himself to breathe slowly, the fury in his chest gradually giving way to cold, deliberate resolve. Then we will not act rashly, Mr. Pratt. We will act with the same honesty that has served us well thus far. Summon Henry to a meeting, here, tomorrow morning. I believe it is time we settled this matter once and for all, without further games or hidden threats delivered through anonymous messengers. The following morning, Henry arrived at the townhouse with visible wariness, clearly uncertain what awaited him despite his outward composure. Alexander received him in the study, Charlotte seated quietly beside him, along with Mr. Pratt standing near the window, and to Henry's evident surprise, Aunt Beatrice as well, her expression carrying the particular sternness of a woman prepared for battle. I understand you have been busy these past weeks, Henry, Alexander began without preamble, digging through my mother's final illness in search of ammunition against myself and Miss Ashworth. Henry's composure flickered, though he attempted to maintain his usual confident demeanor. I merely sought information relevant to the family's interests, Alexander. Nothing more. You sought weapons, Henry, and you found them in the private suffering of a woman who has been dead for 11 years. A woman whose only crime was an illness she could not control, and a husband who loved her enough to sacrifice his own reputation rather than see her shamed by institutional confinement. Alexander's voice remained controlled, though the intensity behind it was unmistakable. I know what you intended to do with Dr. Whitfield's journals, Henry. I know you hoped to suggest some hereditary weakness in myself, some justification for questioning my fitness to hold this family's title. Henry's face had gone pale, clearly unprepared for the direct confrontation now unfolding before him. I do not know what you are referring to. Do not insult us further with denials, Henry, Beatrice interjected sharply. We know precisely what you have been doing, and I confess, I find myself rather ashamed to share blood with someone willing to weaponize a dead woman's private suffering for the sake of personal ambition. Henry's carefully constructed composure finally crumbled entirely beneath the combined weight of the room's collective judgment. I only wanted what I believed I deserved, he said, his voice losing its earlier confidence. I have spent my entire life standing in your shadow, Alexander, watching you inherit everything simply by accident of birth, while I remained merely the spare relation, useful only in the event of your failure to produce an heir. That does not excuse what you have done, Henry, Alexander said, though something in his tone softened slightly at the raw honesty finally emerging from his cousin. Resentment over circumstances of birth is not justification for cruelty toward the memory of a woman who suffered enough in life without her private pain becoming a weapon after death. Henry lowered his gaze, the fight visibly draining from him. What do you intend to do with this knowledge, Alexander? I assume you did not summon me here merely to confirm what you already suspected. Alexander considered his response carefully, aware that whatever he chose next would shape not only his relationship with Henry, but the broader legacy he hoped to build going forward, distinct from the silence and secrecy that had characterized his father's approach to difficult truths. I do not intend to destroy you, Henry. Though you have certainly given me sufficient cause, I intend instead to offer you a choice. Henry looked up, surprise evident in his expression. A choice? You will cease this campaign against Charlotte and myself, entirely and permanently. You will return whatever documents your agent has gathered regarding my mother's illness, and you will make no further attempt to use her memory, or Charlotte's history, as instruments in your pursuit of this family's title. Alexander's voice remained steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had finally found solid ground beneath years of uncertainty. In exchange, I will not expose your recent conduct to the wider family, nor allow it to become the scandal it certainly could become, should I choose to make it public. Henry absorbed this offer in silence for a long moment, clearly weighing the considerable mercy being extended against the humiliation of accepting it. And if I refuse, then I will ensure every member of this family, along with anyone in London society who cares to listen, understands precisely what lengths you were willing to pursue in your ambition For a title you have no legitimate claim to inherit, so long as I live and produce an heir of my own." Alexander's gaze did not waver. "The choice, Henry, is entirely yours." Henry's shoulders sagged, the weight of defeat settling visibly over him. "You have made your point, Alexander. I accept your terms, though I suspect you already knew I would, given the alternative you have offered." "I hoped you would, Henry, for both our sakes. Whatever distance has grown between us over the years, you remain family, and I find I have little appetite for further conflict, particularly after everything these past weeks have taught me about the cost of prolonged estrangement within our family." Alexander extended his hand, an offer of reconciliation Henry seemed genuinely surprised to receive. Henry hesitated only briefly before accepting the gesture, something like genuine relief crossing his features, as the tension that had defined their relationship for years finally began, however tentatively, to ease. "Perhaps in time, we might find a way to rebuild something better than what has existed between us these past years." "Perhaps," Alexander agreed, "though I suspect that rebuilding, like most worthwhile things, will require considerably more honesty than either of us has practiced thus far." Henry departed shortly after, considerably humbled from the confident figure who had arrived that morning, and Alexander turned to find Charlotte watching him with quiet pride evident in her expression. "You handled that with more grace than I believe I could have managed, given everything Henry attempted against us." "I learned something important these past weeks, watching my father's mistakes reveal themselves through his letter, and watching Henry's ambition nearly cost him any relationship with what remains of his family," Alexander said, taking her hand gently in his own. "Silence and secrecy, however well-intentioned, tend only to compound suffering rather than prevent it. I find I would rather face difficult truths directly, even when doing so proves painful, than allow them to fester into the kind of estrangement that cost my father and myself 11 years we can never fully reclaim." In the weeks that followed Henry's confrontation, Alexander found himself drawn increasingly toward the quiet contemplation his father must have practiced during his own final years, though Alexander's reflection carried hope rather than regret. He spent long evenings in the estate's library, reading through correspondence between his mother and Margaret Ashworth that Beatrice had located among old family papers, letters that revealed a friendship far richer and more genuine than either Alexander or Charlotte had previously understood. "Listen to this one," Alexander said one evening, Charlotte seated beside him near the fire, as he read aloud from a letter dated some 20 years earlier. "Margaret writes that she envies nothing in this world so much as your steady heart, dearest Eleanor, for you have taught me that love need not announce itself loudly to be real, only faithfully, and only often." Charlotte smiled softly, leaning closer to examine the faded handwriting herself. "My mother spoke similarly, in her own way, though she rarely allowed herself such open sentiment. I believe now she carried more grief over the severed connection than she ever admitted to me directly. Perhaps that is why she never spoke of it," Alexander suggested. "Some truths become easier to bury than to carry forward, especially when carrying them forward means confronting old wounds that never properly healed." "You sound remarkably like your aunt when you speak that way," Charlotte teased gently, though warmth softened the observation considerably. "I have been spending considerable time in her company these past weeks," Alexander admitted. "She has taught me a great deal about this family's history, far more than my father ever shared, though I suspect he intended to, eventually, before illness took that opportunity from him entirely." Beatrice herself visited frequently during this period, delighting in what she called the reawakening of the Whitmore family spirit, long dormant beneath years of careful distance and unspoken grief. She took particular pleasure in introducing Charlotte properly to distant relatives who had, in previous generations, refused acknowledgement of the Ashworth branch, watching with evident satisfaction as old prejudices gradually softened beneath the obvious devotion between Alexander and his intended bride. "Your mother would be so very pleased," Beatrice told Charlotte one afternoon, the two women walking together through the estate's gardens, while Alexander attended to matters of business correspondence. "She spent her final years wishing circumstances had allowed her to claim your mother's friendship openly, rather than hiding it beneath layers of social caution. I believe she would find great comfort in knowing that friendship has finally borne fruit, however many years later than either of them hoped." "I only wish I had known sooner," Charlotte admitted. "So many years spent believing my family had simply ended, when in truth, an entire branch existed just beyond my reach, waiting only for someone brave enough to reach back across the distance." "Edmund was not always brave," Beatrice said thoughtfully, "but in the end, when it mattered most, he found sufficient courage to set things right, even if he could not manage the task entirely on his own. That courage, passed now to his son, seems to have accomplished what he alone could not. As autumn deepened into the preparations for the wedding, Alexander made arrangements to formally acknowledge Charlotte's place within the family's history, commissioning a portrait of Margaret Ashworth to hang alongside the gallery of family paintings that lined the estate's main hallway, a quiet but permanent correction to decades of deliberate erasure. Charlotte wept when she first saw it completed, moved beyond words at seeing her mother finally granted the recognition denied to her throughout her own lifetime. "It is a small thing, perhaps," Alexander said, standing beside her before the newly hung portrait, compared to the years of acknowledgement she was denied while living. "But I hope it serves as some measure of the honor she deserved all along." "It is not a small thing at all," Charlotte replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It is everything, Alexander. You have given my mother, and by extension myself, a place within this family that history tried so hard to deny us. I do not believe I could ask for anything more meaningful than that." 3 months later, Alexander and Charlotte married in a small ceremony at the same Hampshire chapel where Edmund Whitmore had been laid to rest, surrounded by family who had, in the months since Henry's confrontation, come to embrace Charlotte fully as one of their own. Aunt Beatrice wept openly throughout the service, declaring afterward that she had not seen the Whitmore family so genuinely happy in over a decade. Even Henry attended, standing quietly near the back of the chapel, his earlier ambitions replaced by something closer to genuine goodwill, however imperfectly expressed. Following the ceremony, Alexander and Charlotte walked together to Edmund's grave, now marked by a proper headstone bearing the family crest, and a simple inscription Alexander had chosen himself in the weeks following the funeral. "Beloved father, flawed but faithful, who loved enough to sacrifice, and finally found the courage to tell the truth." "I wish he could have met you properly," Alexander said quietly, kneeling to place fresh flowers against the stone. "I wish he could have seen how his final letter changed everything, rather than only imagining what might come of it." "Perhaps he knew," Charlotte said softly, kneeling beside him. "Perhaps that is precisely why he chose me to deliver it, trusting that whatever happened next would unfold exactly as it was meant to." Alexander looked at her, love and gratitude mixing freely in his expression now, no longer guarded by the careful distance that had once defined every aspect of his life. "Whatever his reasons, I find myself endlessly grateful for the choice he made. You arrived at my door carrying a truth I did not wish to hear, and you gave me back everything I believed I had lost, my father's love, my own capacity for honesty, and a future I could not have imagined possible only months before." They rose together, hand in hand, and walked back toward the estate that would now be theirs to build a future within, no longer haunted by silence and secrecy, but grounded instead in the honest truth that had finally set both of them free. Behind them, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds that had gathered over Hampshire for weeks, casting warm light across the churchyard where Edmund Whitmore's final message had at last found its complete and proper resting place, not merely in the words of a letter, but in the life his son now intended to build upon its truth. Winter settled over Hampshire the following year, blanketing the estate in a quiet, gentle snow that reminded Alexander of childhood mornings he had nearly forgotten, before grief and silence had claimed so much of his memory. He stood now at the same window where he had once watched Charlotte's carriage arrive that first afternoon, though the view before him carried none of the anxious weight it once had, only warmth, and the particular contentment of a man who had finally made peace with his own history. Charlotte found him there, her hand resting gently against the small curve of her stomach, a secret they had shared with the family only weeks before. "You are thinking of him again." "Always, in weather like this," Alexander admitted, turning to draw her close against him. "He loved the first snow of winter. I had forgotten that, until this morning, watching it fall over the same meadow where he taught me to ride. I believe he would be rather pleased, watching all of this unfold," Charlotte said softly. "The portrait in the hallway, our marriage, and soon, a grandchild he never had the chance to meet, though I suspect he already knows, wherever he is now." Alexander smiled at the thought, no longer burdened by the bitterness that had once defined every memory of his father. "I have been thinking lately of writing him a letter of my own, foolish perhaps, given he will never read it, but I find I have things I wish to say that feel unfinished otherwise." "I do not think that foolish at all," Charlotte said. "I still speak to my mother sometimes, in quiet moments. I do not believe grief ever fully departs, only softens, becoming something closer to companionship than pain." That evening, after Charlotte had retired for the night, Alexander sat alone in his study, the same room where he had once refused to attend his father's funeral, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, before flowing more freely as he continued, describing everything that had unfolded since that gray morning when Charlotte first appeared at his door, The letter, the funeral, Henry's schemes and eventual reconciliation, the wedding, and now, the quiet joy of a child expected in the spring. He wrote of forgiveness, finally understood rather than merely offered. He wrote of the portrait now hanging in the hallway, correcting decades of silence with a single act of honest acknowledgement. He wrote, most of all, of gratitude, for a father who had loved imperfectly, but deeply, and who had found, in his final months, the courage to ensure that love was not lost entirely to the silence that had defined so many of their final years together. When he finished, Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it not in a drawer to be forgotten, but within the family Bible kept in the estate's small chapel, alongside records of births, deaths, and marriages that stretched back generations. It seemed a fitting place, he thought, for a message meant to close one chapter of the family's history while quietly beginning another. Spring arrived with the birth of their daughter, whom they named Eleanor Margaret, honoring both grandmothers whose friendship had, against all odds and decades of enforced separation, ultimately brought Alexander and Charlotte together. Beatrice wept openly at the christening, declaring the name a fitting tribute to two women who had never lived to see how deeply their bond would shape the family's future. Henry attended as well, his relationship with Alexander having grown steadily warmer in the months since their confrontation, though never quite reaching the closeness either might have once hoped for as children. He brought a small gift for the infant, a silver rattle that had belonged to his own mother, offered with a humility that would have seemed impossible from the man who had once stood in Alexander's drawing room, spreading doubt and suspicion before all of London society. "She is beautiful, Alexander," Henry said, watching Charlotte hold their daughter near the chapel's altar. "You have built something rather remarkable here, considering how it all began." "We have built it together," Alexander replied, though he extended his hand toward his cousin in a gesture that had become familiar since their reconciliation. "I do not believe I could have managed any of this alone, least of all forgiving you as readily as I eventually did." "I do not deserve that forgiveness," Henry admitted quietly, "though I find myself grateful for it regardless. I have learned, this past year, that ambition without honesty leads only to isolation, however much title or fortune one might eventually claim. A lesson my father learned rather too late in his own life," Alexander observed. "I am glad you found it sooner than he did." In the months following Eleanor's birth, Alexander found himself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had brought him to this point, a path that began with grief and silence and ended, unexpectedly, in a happiness he had never believed himself capable of finding. He took to walking the estate's grounds each morning with Charlotte, their daughter bundled warmly against the Hampshire chill, retracing paths he had once avoided entirely because they carried too many memories of a father he believed had stopped loving him. "I used to avoid this meadow," he confessed to Charlotte one such morning, gesturing toward the open field where his father had once taught him to ride. "For years, I could not walk past it without feeling the weight of everything we lost between us. Now I find myself drawn here almost daily, wanting Eleanor to grow up knowing this place the way I once did, before everything changed." "Perhaps that is the truest gift he left you," Charlotte suggested, adjusting the blanket around their daughter's small shoulders. "Not simply the truth contained in his letter, but the chance to reclaim everything that truth had once obscured." Alexander considered this as they continued their walk, the morning frost crunching softly beneath their boots. "I have been meaning to ask you something, though I confess I have hesitated for reasons I cannot fully explain." "You may ask me anything, Alexander. Do you ever regret it, agreeing to carry that letter, knowing what it might cost you, knowing my family's reputation for burying uncomfortable truths rather than facing them?" Alexander's voice carried genuine uncertainty, a vulnerability he had grown more comfortable expressing since their marriage began. Charlotte stopped walking, turning to face him directly, her expression carrying the same steady honesty that had first caught his attention on that gray afternoon so many months before. "Not for a single moment, Alexander. Your father asked one final thing of me, and in fulfilling that promise, I found not only the truth he wished you to know, but a family I never knew existed, and a husband I could not have imagined finding under any other circumstances. Whatever difficulty it cost me, in Henry's schemes or society's scrutiny, I would carry that letter again 1,000 times over, knowing where it would eventually lead us." Relief and gratitude mixed freely in Alexander's expression as he drew her close, their daughter murmuring softly between them at the sudden movement. "I am grateful every single day that my father chose you, of everyone he might have entrusted with such a task." "As am I," Charlotte replied softly, though I suspect in his own quiet way, he understood exactly what he was setting in motion when he made that choice, even if neither of us could have predicted precisely how it would unfold. As the years passed, Alexander often returned to that letter tucked within the family Bible, adding new pages as significant moments unfolded. The birth of a second child, a son named Edmund after the grandfather he would never meet, Beatrice's peaceful passing surrounded by family who had come to cherish her guidance, and Henry's eventual marriage to a woman whose steady influence seemed to soften whatever ambition still lingered from his younger years. Charlotte, for her part, took particular joy in maintaining the connection between the Whitmore and Ashworth branches that had been so carelessly severed generations before her birth. She corresponded regularly with distant relatives once considered unsuitable for acknowledgement, weaving together a family history that grew richer and more complete with each passing year, no longer burdened by the shame and secrecy that had defined it for so long. On the 10th anniversary of Edmund's death, Alexander and Charlotte returned to Hampshire with their children, now old enough to understand something of the story that had brought their parents together. They stood before the grave, now weathered slightly by a decade of passing seasons, and Alexander read aloud the letter he had written that first winter, sharing with his children the truth their grandfather had waited too long to speak, but had ultimately found the courage to reveal before it was too late. "Grandfather sounds like he was very brave," young Eleanor said thoughtfully, studying the headstone with the particular seriousness children sometimes bring to matters they do not fully understand, even though he was scared. "He was," Alexander agreed, kneeling beside his daughter. "Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit they were wrong, even when it is difficult, even when it comes very late. I hope you will remember that, both of you, far better than I managed to understand it myself, until a stranger arrived at my door carrying a letter I did not wish to read." Charlotte took his hand, watching their children place fresh flowers against the weathered stone, and felt, not for the first time, an overwhelming gratitude for the winding path that had led her from a small cottage in Hampshire to this life she now shared with a man who had once refused, absolutely, to attend his own father's funeral. "He would be proud of you," she said quietly, as their children continued their careful arrangement of flowers before them, "not simply for the title you carry, but for everything you have built with the truth he finally found the courage to share." "He would be proud of us," Alexander corrected gently, drawing her close against him as the afternoon light softened over the Hampshire countryside. "This story was never mine alone to complete. It began with his final message, but it became something far greater than either of us could have imagined, built on honesty rather than silence, on love acknowledged rather than buried beneath decades of careful, painful distance." They remained a while longer at the graveside, the quiet comfort of family surrounding them, before finally turning back toward the estate that had once felt so cold and distant to Alexander, now filled instead with the warmth his father had always intended for it, delivered finally, completely, through the courage of one final message, and the stranger brave enough to carry it home,